Chapter 27, Mutual Confidences. March came in that winter like the meekest and mildest of lambs, bringing days that were crisp and golden and tingling, each followed by a frosty pink twilight, which gradually lost itself in an elf land of moonshine. Over the girls at Patty's Place was falling the shadow of April examinations. They were studying hard. Even Phil had settled down to text and notebooks with a doggedness not to be expected of her. "I'm going to take the Johnson Scholarship in Mathematics," she announced calmly. "I could take the one in Greek easily, but I'd rather take the mathematical one because I want to prove to Jonas that I'm really enormously clever." "Jonas likes you better for your big brown eyes and your crooked smile than for all the brains you carry under your curls," said Anne. "When I was a girl, it wasn't considered ladylike to know anything about mathematics," said Aunt Jamesina. "But times have changed. I don't know that it's all for the better." "Can you cook, Phil?" "No, I've never cooked anything in my life except a gingerbread, and it was a failure, flat in the middle and a hilly round the edges. You know the kind. But, Auntie, when I begin in good earnest to learn to cook, don't you think the brains that enable me to win a mathematical scholarship will also enable me to learn cooking just as well?" "Maybe," said Aunt Jamesina cautiously. "I am not decrying the higher education of women. My daughter is an M.A. She can cook, too, but I taught her to cook before I let a college professor teach her mathematics." In mid-March came a letter from Miss Patty Spofford saying that she and Miss Maria had decided to remain abroad for another year. "So you may have Patty's Place next winter too," she wrote. "Maria and I are going to run over Egypt. I want to see the Sphinx once before I die." "Fancy those two dames running over Egypt. I wonder if they look up at the Sphinx and knit," laughed Priscilla. "I'm so glad we can keep Patty's Place for another year," said Stella. "I was afraid they'd come back, and then our jolly little nest here would be broken up, and we poor callow nestlings thrown out into the cruel world of boarding houses again." "I'm off for a tramp in the park," announced Phil, tossing her book aside. "I think when I am 80, I'll be glad I went for a walk in the park tonight." "What do you mean?" asked Anne. "Come with me and I'll tell you, honey." They captured in their ramble all the mysteries and magics of a March evening. Very still and mild it was, wrapped in a great white brooding silence, a silence which was yet threaded through with many little silvery sounds which you could hear if you hearkened as much with your soul as your ears. The girls wandered down a long pineland aisle that seemed to lead right out into the heart of a deep red, overflowing winter sunset. "I'd go home and write a poem this blessed minute if only I knew how," declared Phil, pausing in an open space where a rosy light was staining the green tips of the pines. "It's all so wonderful here, this great white stillness and those dark trees that always seem to be thinking." "The woods were God's first temples," quoted Anne softly. "One can't help feeling reverent and adoring in such a place. I always feel so near him when I walk among the pines." "Anne, I'm the happiest girl in the world," confessed Phil suddenly. "So Mr. Blake has asked you to marry him at last," said Anne calmly. "Yes, and I sneezed 3 times while he was asking. Wasn't that horrid? But I said yes almost before he finished. I was so afraid he might change his mind and stop. I'm besottedly happy. I couldn't really believe that before that Jonas would ever care for frivolous me." "Phil, you're not really frivolous," said Anne gravely. "Way down underneath that frivolous exterior of yours you've got a dear, loyal, womanly little soul. Why do you hide it so?" "I can't help it, Queen Anne. You're right. I'm not frivolous at heart, but there's a sort of frivolous skin over my soul, and I can't take it off. As Mrs. Poyser says, I'd have to be hatched over again and hatched different before I could change it. But Jonas knows the real me and loves me, frivolity and all, and I love him. I never was so surprised in my life as I was when I found out I loved him. I'd never thought it possible to fall in love with an ugly man. Fancy me coming down to one solitary beau, and one named Jonas, but I mean to call him Joe. That's such a nice, crisp little name. I couldn't nickname Alonzo." "What about Alec and Alonzo?" "Oh, I told them at Christmas time that I never could marry either of them. It seems so funny now to remember that I never ever thought it possible that I might. They felt so badly I just cried over both of them, howled, but I knew there was only one man in the world I could ever marry. I had made up my own mind for once, and it was real easy too. It's very delightful to feel so sure and know it's your own sureness and not somebody else's." "Do you suppose you'll be able to keep it up?" "Making up my mind, you mean?" "I don't know, but Joe has given me a splendid rule. He says when I'm perplexed just to do what I would wish I had done when I shall be 80. Anyhow, Joe can make up his mind quickly enough, and it would be uncomfortable to have too much mind in the same house." "What will your father and mother say?" Father won't say much. He thinks everything I do right. But Mother will talk. Oh, her tongue will be as irony as her nose. But in the end, it'll be all right. You'll have to give up a good many things you've always had when you marry Mr. Blakeville. But I'll have him. I won't miss the other things. We're to be married a year from next June. Joe graduates from St. Columba this spring, you know. Then he's going to take a little mission church down on Patterson Street into the slums. Fancy me in the slums. But I'd go there or to Greenland's icy mountains with him. And this is the girl who would never marry a man who wasn't rich, commented Anne to a young pine tree. Oh, don't cast up the follies of my youth to me. I shall be poor as gaily as I've been rich. You'll see. I'm going to learn how to cook and make over dresses. I've learned how to market since I've lived at Patty's place, and once I taught a Sunday school class for a whole summer. Aunt Jamesina says I'll ruin Joe's career if I marry him. But I won't. I know I haven't much sense or sobriety, but I've got what it is ever so much better, the knack of making people like me. There is a man in Bolingbroke who lisps and always testifies in prayer meeting. He says, if you can't thine like an electric star, thine like a candlestick. I'll be Joe's little candlestick. Phil, you're incorrigible. Well, I love you so much that I can't make nice, light, congratulatory little speeches, but I'm heart glad of your happiness. I know. Those big gray eyes of yours are brimming over with real friendship, Anne. Someday I'll look the same way at you. You're going to marry Roy, aren't you, Anne? My dear Philippa, did you ever hear of the famous Betty Baxter who refused a man before he'd axed her? I am not going to emulate that celebrated lady by either refusing or accepting anyone before he axes me. All Redmond knows that Roy is crazy about you, said Phil candidly. And you do love him, don't you, Anne? I suppose so, said Anne reluctantly. She felt that she ought to be blushing while making such a confession, but she was not. On the other hand, she always blushed hotly when anyone said anything about Gilbert Blythe or Christine Stuart in her hearing. Gilbert Blythe and Christine Stuart were nothing to her, absolutely nothing. But Anne had given up trying to analyze the reason of her blushes. As for Roy, of course she was in love with him. Madly so. How could she help it? Was he not her ideal? Who could resist those glorious dark eyes and that pleading voice? Were not half the Redmond girls wildly envious? And what a charming sonnet he had sent her with a box of violets on her birthday. Anne knew every word of it by heart. It was very good stuff of its kind, too. Not exactly up to the level of Keats or Shakespeare. Even Anne was not so deeply in love as to think that. But it was very tolerable magazine verse. Excuse me. And it was addressed to her, not to Laura or Beatrice or the Maid of Athens, but to her, Anne Shirley. To be told in rhythmical cadences that her eyes were stars of the morning, that her cheek had the flush it stole from the sunrise, that her lips were redder than the roses of paradise, was thrillingly romantic. Gilbert would never have dreamed of writing a sonnet to her eyebrows. But then Gilbert could see a joke. She had once told Roy a funny story, and he had not seen the point of it. She recalled the chummy laugh she and Gilbert had had together over it, and wondered uneasily if life with a man who had no sense of humor might not be somewhat uninteresting in the long run. But who could expect a melancholy, inscrutable hero to see the humorous side of things? It would be flatly unreasonable. Chapter 28. A June evening. I wonder what it would be like to live in a world where it was always June, said Anne, as she came through the spice and bloom of the twilight orchard to the front doorsteps where Marilla and Mrs. Rachel were sitting talking over Mrs. Sampson Coates's funeral, which they had attended that day. Dora sat between them, diligently studying her lessons, but Davy was sitting tailor fashion on the grass, looking as gloomy and depressed as his single dimple would let him. You get tired of it, said Marilla with a sigh. I dare say, but just now I feel that it would take me a long time to get tired of it if it were all as charming as today. Everything loves June. Davy boy, why this melancholy November face in blossom time? I'm just sick and tired of living, said the youthful pessimist. At 10 years? Dear me, how sad. Who's got a fire? Put it out. Sorry. I'm not making fun, said Davy with dignity. I'm discouraged, bringing out the big word with a valiant effort. Why and wherefore? Asked Anne, sitting down beside him. Because the new teacher that come when Mr. Holmes got sick gave me 10 sums to do for Monday. It'll take me all day tomorrow to do them. It isn't fair to have to work Saturdays. Milty Boulter said he wouldn't do them, but Marilla says I've got to. I don't like Miss Carson a bit. Don't talk like that about your teacher, Davy Keith, said Mrs. Rachel severely. Miss Carson is a very fine girl. There is no nonsense about her. That doesn't sound very attractive, laughed Anne. I like people to have a little nonsense about them, but I'm inclined to have a better opinion of Miss Carson than you have. I saw her in prayer meeting last night, and she has a pair of eyes that can't always look sensible. Now, Davy boy, take heart of grace. Tomorrow will bring another day, and I'll help you with the sums as far as in me lies. Don't waste this lovely hour twixt light and dark worrying over arithmetic. Well, I won't, said Davy, brightening up. If you help me with the sums, I'll have them done in time to go fishing with Milty. I wish old Aunt Atusa's funeral was tomorrow instead of today. I wanted to go to it because Milty said his mother said Aunt Atusa would be sure to rise up in her coffin and say sarcastic things to the folks that come to see her buried, but Marilla said she didn't. Poor Atusa laid in her coffin peaceful enough, said Mrs. Lynde solemnly. I never saw her look so pleasant before, that's what. Well, there wasn't many tears shed over her poor old soul. The Alicia Wrights are thankful to be rid of her, and I can't say I blame them a mite. It seems to me a most dreadful thing to go out of the world and not leave one person behind you who is sorry you are gone, said Anne, shuddering. Nobody except her parents ever loved poor Atusa, that's certain. Not even her husband, averred Mrs. Lynde. She was his fourth wife. He sort of got into the habit of marrying. He only lived a few years after he married her. The doctor said he died of dyspepsia, but I shall always maintain that he died of Atusa's tongue. That's what. Poor soul. She always knew everything about her neighbors, but she never was very well acquainted with herself. Well, she's gone anyhow, and I suppose the next excitement will be Diana's wedding. It seems so funny and horrible to think of Diana's being married, sighed Anne, hugging her knees and looking through the gap in the haunted wood to the light that was shining in Diana's room. I don't see what's horrible about it when she's doing so well, said Mrs. Lynde emphatically. Fred Wright is a fine farm, and he is a model young man. He certainly isn't the wild, dashing, wicked young man Diana once wanted to marry, smiled Anne. Fred is extremely good. That's what he ought to be. Would you want Diana to marry a wicked man or marry one yourself? Oh, no, I wouldn't want to marry anybody who was wicked, but I think I'd like it if he could be wicked and wouldn't. Now, Fred is hopelessly good. You'll have more sense someday, I hope, said Marilla. Marilla spoke rather bitterly. She was grievously disappointed. She knew Anne had refused Gilbert Blythe. Avonlea gossip buzzed over the fact, which had leaked out, nobody knew how. Perhaps Charlie Sloane had guessed and told his guesses for truth. Perhaps Diana had betrayed it to Fred, and Fred had been indiscreet. At all events, it was known. Mrs. Blythe no longer asked Anne in public or private if she had heard lately from Gilbert, but passed her by with a frosty bow. Anne, who had always liked Gilbert's merry, young-hearted mother, was grieved in secret over this. Marilla said nothing, but Mrs. Lynde gave Anne many exasperated digs about it, until fresh gossip reached that worthy lady through the medium of Moody Spurgeon, Macpherson's mother, that Anne had another beau at college, who was rich and handsome and good all in one. After that, Mrs. Rachel held her tongue, though she still wished in her innermost heart that Anne had accepted Gilbert. Riches were all very well, but even Mrs. Rachel's practical soul, though she was, did not consider them the one essential. If Anne liked the handsome unknown better than Gilbert, there was nothing more to be said, but Mrs. Rachel was dreadfully afraid that Anne was going to make the mistake of marrying for money. Marilla knew Anne too well to fear this, but she felt that something in the universal scheme of things had gone sadly awry. What is to be will be, said Mrs. Rachel gloomily, and what isn't to be happens sometimes. I can't help believing it's going to happen in Anne's case if Providence doesn't interfere, that's what. Mrs. Rachel sighed. She was afraid Providence wouldn't interfere, and she didn't dare to. Anne had wandered down to the Dryad's Bubble and was curled up among the ferns at the root of the big white birch where she and Gilbert had so often sat in summers gone by. He had gone into the newspaper office again when college closed, and Avonlea seemed very dull without him. He never wrote to her, and Anne missed the letters that never came. To be sure, Roy wrote twice a week. His letters were exquisite compositions, which would have read beautifully in a memoir or biography. Anne felt herself more deeply in love with him than ever when she read them, but her heart never gave the queer, quick, painful bound at sight of his letters, which it had given one day when Mrs. Hiram Sloane had handed her out an envelope addressed in Gilbert's black, upright handwriting. Anne had hurried home to the east gable and opened it eagerly to find a typewritten copy of some college society paper, only that and nothing more. Anne flung the harmless screed across her room and sat down to write an especially nice epistle to Roy. Diana was to be married in 5 more days. The gray house at Orchard Slope was in a turmoil of baking and brewing and boiling and stewing, for there was to be a big old-timey wedding. Anne, of course, was to be bridesmaid, as had been arranged when they were 12 years old, and Gilbert was coming from Kingsport to be best man. Anne was enjoying the excitement of the various preparations, but under it all she carried a little heartache. She was in a sense losing her dear old chum. Diana's new home would be 2 miles from Green Gables, and the old constant companionship could never be theirs again. Anne looked up at Diana's light and thought how it had beaconed to her for many years, but soon it would shine through the summer twilights no more. 2 big, painful tears welled up in her gray eyes. Oh, she thought, how horrible it is that people have to grow up and marry and change. Chapter 29. Diana's Wedding. After all, the only real roses are the pink ones, said Anne, as she tied white ribbon around Diana's bouquet in the westward-looking gable at Orchard Slope. They are the flowers of love and faith. Diana was standing nervously in the middle of the room, arrayed in her bridal white, her black curls frosted over with the film of her wedding veil. Anne had draped that veil in accordance with the sentimental compact of years before. It's all pretty much as I had used to imagine it long ago when I wept over your inevitable marriage and our consequent parting, she laughed. You are the bride of my dreams, Diana, with the lovely misty veil, and I am your bridesmaid. But alas, I haven't the puffed sleeves, though. These short lace ones are even prettier. Neither is my heart wholly breaking, nor do I exactly hate Fred. We're not really parting, Anne, protested Diana. I'm not going far away. We'll love each other just as much as ever. We've always kept that oath of friendship we swore long ago, haven't we? Yes, we've kept it faithfully. We've had a beautiful friendship, Diana. We've never marred it by one quarrel or coolness or unkind word, and I hope it will always be so. But things can't be quite the same after this. You'll have other interests. I'll just be on the outside. But such is life, as Mrs. Rachel says. Mrs. Rachel has given you one of her beloved knitted quilts of the tobacco stripe pattern. She says when I am married she'll give me one too. The mean thing about your getting married is that I won't be able to be your bridesmaid, lamented Diana. I'm to be Phil's bridesmaid next June when she marries Mr. Blake, and then I must stop, for you know the proverb, 3 times a bridesmaid, never a bride, said Anne, peeping through the window over the pink and snow of the blossoming orchard beneath. Here comes the minister, Diana. Oh, Anne, gasped Diana, suddenly turning very pale and beginning to tremble. Oh, Anne, I'm so nervous. I can't go through with it. And I know I'm going to faint. If you do, I'll drag you down to the rainwater hogshed and drop you in, said Anne sympathetically. Cheer up, dearest. Getting married can't be so very terrible when so many people survive the ceremony. See how cool and composed I am, and take courage. Wait till your turn comes, Miss Anne. Oh, Anne, I hear my father coming upstairs. Give me my bouquet. Is my veil right? Am I very pale? You look just lovely, Di. Darling, kiss me goodbye for the last time. Diana Barry will never kiss me again. Diana Wright will, though. There's Mother calling. Come. Following the simple old-fashioned way in vogue then, Anne went down to the parlor on Gilbert's arm. They met at the top of the stairs for the first time since they had left Kingsport, for Gilbert had arrived only that day. Gilbert shook hands courteously. He was looking very well, though, as Anne instantly noted, rather thin. He was not pale. There was a flush on his cheek that had burned into it as Anne came along the dim hall towards him in her soft white dress with lilies of the valley and the shining masses of her hair. As they entered the crowded parlor together, a little murmur of admiration ran around the room. What a fine-looking pair they are, whispered the impressible Mrs. Rachel to Marilla. Fred ambled in alone with a very red face, and then Diana swept in on her father's arm. She did not faint, and nothing untoward occurred to interrupt the ceremony. Feasting and merrymaking followed. Then, as the evening waned, Fred and Diana drove away through the moonlight to their new home, and Gilbert walked with Anne to Green Gables. Something of their old comradeship had returned during the informal mirth of the evening. Oh, it was nice to be walking over that well-known road with Gilbert again. The night was so very still that one should have been able to hear the whisper of roses in blossom, the laughter of daisies, the piping of grasses, many sweet sounds all tangled up together. The beauty of moonlight on a familiar fields irradiated the world. Can't we take a ramble up Lover's Lane before you go in? Asked Gilbert as they crossed the bridge over the lake of shining waters, in which the moon lay like a great drowned blossom of gold. Anne assented readily. Lover's Lane was a veritable path in a fairyland that night, a shimmering, mysterious place full of wizardry in the white woven enchantment of moonlight. There had been a time when such a walk with Gilbert through Lover's Lane would have been far too dangerous, but Roy and Christine had made it very safe now. Anne found herself thinking a good deal about Christine as she chattered lightly to Gilbert. She had met her several times before leaving Kingsport and had been charmingly sweet to her. Christine had also been charmingly sweet. Indeed, they were a most cordial pair. But for all that, their acquaintance had not ripened into friendship. Evidently, Christine was not a kindred spirit. "Are you going to be in Avonlea all summer?" asked Gilbert. "No, I'm going down east to Valley Road next week. Esther Haythorne wants me to teach for her through July and August. They have a summer term in that school, and Esther isn't feeling well, so I'm going to substitute for her. In one way, I don't mind. Do you know, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like a stranger in Avonlea now. It makes me sorry, but it's true. It's quite appalling to see the number of children who have shot up into big boys and girls, really young men and women, these past 2 years. Half of my pupils are grown up. It makes me feel awfully old to see them in the places you and I and our mates used to fill." Anne laughed and sighed. She felt very old and mature and wise, which showed how young she was. She told herself that she longed greatly to go back to those dear merry days when life was seen through a rosy mist of hope and illusion, and possessed an indefinable something that had passed away forever. Where was it now? The glory and the dream? "So wags the world," quoted Gilbert practically and a trifle absently. Anne wondered if he were thinking of Christine. Oh, Avonlea was going to be so lonely now with Diana gone.